Hi, this is Chuck Stull looking at product differentiation in the beer industry. Now, product differentiation has long been important in the beer industry. And let me start with vertical differentiation. We talked about that earlier in the automobile industry. Here we'd be looking at better beers versus cheaper beers. So market segmentation in the beer industry has been important since the late 1880s, where we have distinct market segments based on price. So the popular beers would be the cheapest ones. So these were the local beers to start with. So these would be the economy beers, the budget beers, the value-priced beers. So today that would be brands like Milwaukee's Best or Busch. More expensive were the premium beers. So Budweiser would be the classic example of a premium beer. So this again was one of the early shipping beers and was selling for a higher price and continues to sell for a higher price than those economy or budget price beers. Now today we think of Budweiser as a mid-priced beer, and that's because we have had several other segments added over time. So the national brewers introduced a higher price segment, the super premium beers. So these would be, say, Michelob, a classic example from Anheuser-Busch. Super premium would have a higher price and a higher quality image than the premium beers. We later had beers selling even more expensive that were brought in from other countries. So this would be our imported beers. And today we have an important segment we'll talk about in a later video, the craft beer segment. So the idea is we have beers ranging from at the bottom of the scale, very inexpensive, and then increasing in price and quality as we move upward. And consumers would then choose the segment and a brand within that segment based on their budget. So some will pay more for the higher quality, others will save money and buy a cheaper beer. And these market segments have really been important in terms of product differentiation in this market. Now, depending on economic circumstances, some of these sectors may grow and others shrink. So in the last recession, 2009, the economy brands, so those popular or very cheap beers, their sales increased by 5%, whereas the premium brands, Budweiser, their sales decreased by 7%. Right? So as consumers were more concerned about cost, they switched from the premium priced to the cheaper popular or budget beers. Let me look at some prices. So these are prices that I collected from the Meyer online website. So beer prices, May 2020, and where available, these are what it would cost to buy a 12-pack of bottles. Now the two very bottom beers weren't available in bottles, at least at Meyer today, and so those are can prices. But we can look and see very, very distinct segments. So we have Stella Artois at $15 for a 12-pack, a classic example of an import. Corona, another import, at $14. Michelob, this is our domestically produced super premium, Michelob Ultra in this case, selling for $13. Now, Molson's technically a import, but you can see it's priced and has been priced for the last several years as a premium beer. So priced exactly the same as Budweiser and Coors. Those would be our classic premium beers. And then we have in our budget sector, Pabst Blue Ribbon. Again, this one was in cans for a 12-pack. Milwaukee's Best came in a 15-pack for $7.99, which I then just converted to what it would cost for a 12-pack of Milwaukee's Best at $6.40. So again, popular priced beers or budget beers, much, much less expensive, right? Less than half the price of the high-end beers. And I would say most people would say that Corona is a much higher quality beer than Milwaukee's Best, or at least many people would. The question is, does it taste any different? But taste is a different issue. Taste comes to horizontal differentiation. So let me turn from our vertical differentiation to horizontal differentiation. So here we're not looking for superior or inferior products, but differences in beer based on the product characteristics. And then consumers would match the product to their own preferences. Right? And the brand would be selected based on taste, not on price. Now, beer is distinguished by two main flavors, maltiness and bitterness. The maltiness comes from the barley, so it's a grainy flavor or a bready flavor. And the bitterness comes from hops, and this has a grassy flavor or a weedy flavor. Now, if we look at that list of beers that we just examined, most of them are neither very malty nor very bitter. Right? In terms of horizontal differentiation, the mainstream beers are very difficult to distinguish. Right? They have flavors that are very similar to each other. So let me draw a little graph looking at maltiness on the vertical axis and bitterness on the horizontal axis. So bitterness is measured in IBUs, and that's one thing that we can differentiate scientifically. Now, if something has no malty flavor and no bitter flavor, right, that would be over in the corner, right, would be, right, water would have no malty flavor. And then as we move up, we get malty or heavier, thicker beers. And as we move to the right, we get more and more bitter beers. Most of the beers we look at in our slide, and most of the mainstream um, American beers, right, fall into this lower corner. They are neither malty nor bitter. If we look at IBUs, which is easier to measure, the Coors might be 9, Corona 12 or 13, Budweiser in that same range, PBR 12. Um, we might get a little bit of more bitter flavor as we move to the Michelob's and Molson with an IBU of 18, and Stella measures out at 24. But if we look at Corona and compare it to Milwaukee's Best, essentially the same. Corona, if anything, a little less flavorful, even though Milwaukee's Best is a much, much less expensive beer. So for a long time, most American beer has been very similar with a relatively light, mild taste. Now, of course, consumers um, can taste beers, but in a blind taste test, most consumers can't differentiate between, say, a Corona and a PBR. Um, Tasting without seeing what the packaging is and knowing what the price is, there's very, very little difference. But consumers don't buy beer blind. They observe the brand, they see the label, they see the different packaging, they're familiar with the advertising in most cases, and they observe the price. And those factors are all influential. Price is a very interesting one. So, economics has borrowed the idea of the price quality heuristic from psychology via behavioral economics. When consumers can't differentiate, they often think, well, you get what you pay for, and use price to judge quality. And that gives us an interesting outcome, is if consumers are judging quality on price, having a high price will make consumers think that there's a better product there, and firms can take advantage of that. Right? Simply increasing the price may change consumers' minds and say this is a better quality product just because it's more expensive. Let me look at a particular brand of beer and look at the rise and fall of Pabst Blue Ribbon. Now, originally, this was a local Milwaukee beer selling for the popular price, right, or the inexpensive price. But then it was one of the early shipping beers, and it became a national beer. But as it moved from Milwaukee to the East Coast, the company needed to charge a higher price in order to cover the shipping costs. And so this was a premium priced beer. But because of the price quality heuristic, consumers said, oh, it's more expensive. This must be a better beer. And PBR gained a premium image, one that was seen as better quality than the local cheaper beers. Now, in the late 50s and into the 60s, um, Pabst started discounting its Blue Ribbon beer in order to increase sales. And initially, that worked really well. Um, right, beer typically has an ordinary demand curve. At lower prices, consumers will buy more. And so, to start with, consumers saw this as a great deal on a good beer. But in the 70s and 80s, the price quality heuristic bit back. The low prices, right, perhaps simply by being cheap, gave it a low quality image. Right? So while the beer inside the package had not changed, consumers' perception of it did. And Pabst rapidly lost market share. It was no longer seen as a premium beer, and it had to compete in the budget beer segment. So that discounting ended up making consumers see Pabst as a cheap, low quality beer. Now, in the last decade or so, there's been a rebound. PBR has a retro appeal. It has cultivated a working class image, and that's something that has resonated with young people. It's seen as a hipster beer. Right? That drinking PBR is cool because it's cheap. And of course, these consumers are perfectly right. PBR tastes just as good as the expensive Mexican import, but at a much, much lower price. We had other beers, Miller High Life, Schlitz, that were at one time premium beers and eventually slid down to bargain basement budget beers without necessarily any change in the product in the package. This is Chuck Stull talking about product differentiation in the beer industry. Thank you for listening.